This week, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Kriss Ravetto-Biagioli, who led seminars on the uncanny in the age of artificial intelligence and the deep fake. And we had a wonderful 2 day seminars, and I'm excited for this talk. So Kriss Ravetto-Biagioli is a professor of film, television, and digital media at UCLA. She is the author of Unmaking Fascist Aesthetics, published by University of Minnesota Press, 2001, Mythopoetic Cinema, published with Columbia University Press in 2017, and Digital Uncanny, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. She's currently working on a co-authored book with Martine Brunier titled The Trouble with Ghosts, Film, Television, and Other Spectral Media, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. So I'll pass the mic along, but please, keep note of your questions and hold on to them, and we'll open things up at the end of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. It's been a pleasure conducting the seminars. Yesterday, we did talk about VR film, and today I'm going to present a couple of films that I see as more critically interesting than the ones that we had discussed yesterday. So I'm just going to jump into it now. Virtual reality technologies have generated a considerable amount of financial investment and critical attention from scientific research, forensic architecture, 3D filmmaking, and digital storytelling, offering new ways of interacting with three-dimensional data in real time. I just want to show you what a camera looks like here for a three-dimensional immersive film camera. These 3D films are said to make people feel as though they are part of the story and let them experience the events. This enhanced emotional effect has led many scholars of 3D filmmakers to argue that VR heightens our feeling of empathy by establishing a sense of presence. But it still remains unclear what this sense of presence or amplified sensibility means. When each VR project is uniquely individualized, it can only be displayed to one viewer at a time. Despite the limitations and in spite of its hype as enhancing each participant or user's sense and sensibility, I would like to argue through my analysis of Lily Hibberd and Gina Kim's work in VR and that 3D 360-degree films offer us something far more radical than stimulating our affective responses. Here, they question our sense of presence, our subjectivity, and sense of embodiment, as well as our abilities to immerse ourselves within the world. What interests me is how Hibberd and Kim's films integrate various forms of documentation and forensic techniques as a means of creating new modalities of relations between the viewer and immersive environments, speculative relations between the past, the present, and the future, or intricate geopolitical connections that often remain opaque. Hibbert's Parragirls Past and Present that came out in 2017, and Gina Kim's 3D immersive trilogy, Bloodless, that came out in 2017, Tearless that came out in 2020, and Comfortless that came out in 2023, are concerned with traumatic events, but rather than evade a troubled past, they reclaim unwanted memories. Completed in 2017, oops, I'll go back here actually. Parragirls Past Present is a 23-minute 360-degree film, viewable both as an immersive installation or through a VR headset. It is a result of a long-term collaboration between the Parragirls, a collective of Australian female survivors of childhood abuse, brutal mistreatment at the hands of state officials and state-run institutional care, and the artist. Kim's immersive VR trilogy instead traces the twin legacy of comfort women, of course, the term used for forced prostitution during World War II, and US militaristic settler imperialism in South Korea. What interests me in these VR projects is how the mapping of real life physical spaces, like the Parramatta Girls' Home, the military-run camp towns featured in Kim's work, do not free us to explore these virtual spaces as many VR projects promise to do, as much as they trap us in what feels like the scene of multiple crimes. By meticulously scanning buildings, artifacts, and documenting locations slotted for oblivion, Hibberd and Kim engage in their own version of accumulating forensic evidence, what I will argue is a form of spectral forensics. They offer us a glimpse at what lies beneath the threshold of detectability, that is, the limit at which a documented, filmed, photograph mapped set of objects embedded in a particular location can approximate the condition in which an event occurred. Beneath the grim facts of sex trafficking, forced prostitution, and sexual violence of all sorts, Kim's films draw attention to the presence of sex workers that are often disregarded, dismissed, or simply treated as a national embarrassment, if not a taboo subject. How do we give presence to those women, situation, and events that were and still are made to disappear? The answer to such a question is complex. In Bloodless, Tearless, and Comfortless, we, as participants, are not asked to identify with sex workers who appear as ghosts, nor are we required to witness their traumatic experiences. Rather, we are immersed within these exceptionally strange spaces, and it is up to us to understand how these spaces were designed to operate, how they were made to make sex worker feel vulnerable, afraid, and marginalized. Being immersed, or perhaps more accurately, confined in such spaces, we get a sense of how they control the women that lived within them. It is this sensation of being there that produces such visceral reactions from many participants, something Kim believes might be akin to empathy. VR has been infamously called an empathy machine by Kriss Milk and Jennifer Elsevier because it does away with the cinematic frame and places the participant virtually in the mise en scène. But this sensation of emplacement has been mistakenly applied to an identification with individuals and the situations or trauma they experience. VR technologies designed to foster empathy often presume to do more than acknowledge the experience of another. They promise the experiencer to possess the space of another. Neither Kim nor Hibberd allows us to inhabit the virtual spaces we see before us. Instead, their rendering of space and the various ghosts that haunt such spaces seem to take possession of our bodies, questioning the boundaries of self and the very notion of self-presence. Rather than attempt to make a case for identifying with ghosts or being able to feel their trauma, I'm interested in how the feeling of being immersed within such uncanny spaces produces its own sense of distance and proximity, a critical as well as emotional understanding without creating some form of individual subjectivity. In the case of Kim's trilogy, this is an uncomfortable type of thinking feeling, one that makes us grasp that both the South Korean and the US governments have tried what they have tried so hard to render invisible, that is, the patron-client relationship between South Korea and the United States, the relation of prostitution to the military and global capital, and the historical silencing of women forced into sex trafficking and prostitution. And in the case of Hibberd, the carceral state's connection to the Catholic Church and the abuse of young women. The Parramatta Girls' Home was a Catholic orphanage that by the end of the 19th century transformed into a punitive reformatory, where teenage girls who were deemed delinquent or at risk were confined. These are people like orphans, aboriginals, or victims of neglect and child abuse. It operated until 1974 before being repurposed again as a female prison until the end of the 1990s. Residents of the Parramatta home were subjected to disciplinary regime of work, punishment, silence, isolation, and physical and sexual exploitation. After its closure, the buildings were abandoned and left to ruin for decades until the land was slotted for redevelopment. Unlike many other collaborative artworks designed to represent traumatic events, Hibberd insists Parragirls is not a therapeutic project. It is not meant to resolve past traumas or provide a sense of closure for either those women who have been marked by years of abuse and the social shaming associated with being in Parramatta, nor to liberate the Australian society that has tried so desperately to forget these women. The main objective was the collective retrieval of a history under erasure. The work, therefore, was to convey experiences of powerlessness and unpredictability. Hibberd chose VR as a platform precisely because it assumed to give control to users, allowing them to forge their own path through virtual environments. Yet with Parragirls, immersive media unfolds before us, isolating us as spectators. So I'm going to show a clip from the VR project. And again, I apologize. This is a distortion because it's a 3D film that I'm showing you in 2 dimensions. So I'm going to show you a few minutes of it and then talk about it.
They won by putting me in here, but they didn't beat me. They were the winners. They got to shut the door. But I'm standing here and it hasn't beaten me.
We walked out the gate 50 years ago and never think nothing more of it. You try to put it behind you. Then all of a sudden, you got to start to remember things, and that Pandora box opened. When you go into any remand, you go for internal examinations. Now, you're virgins at this time. We don't even know what eternal, and I remember being held down by staff members forcing internal, was a silver duck thing or whatever, and you're screaming and the police are standing there and they're not doing a thing. And you was really scared about anything, because after the brutal examination, what they did when you first come in, after that you're thinking, what the hell's else going to happen to you?
They locked the gate behind you, and inside was like 2 small, very small confined areas. There was what you might deem your main area, where you had a chair, and that was all you had, was a chair and a light above your head covered in steel meshing. In the other little part, there was nothing. And the only way you can survive in there is to curl up and go to sleep. That's all you could do to survive that. It was nothingness. It was just cold space, a dark place.
So beginning in a small enclosure, shot in high definition video, everywhere we turn and cast our gaze, we are faced with a wall. As viewers, we are placed low to the ground at the level of a child. It is before this tall stone wall that we start to hear the women's voiceover comments. One woman resonates, they won, they got to put me in here, but they didn't take me. They were the winners, they got to shut the doors, but I'm standing here. With a prolonged fade to black, we are taken to a path covered by a trellis. Another voice reflects, we walked out of the gate 50 years ago. You tried to put it behind you. Then all of a sudden, you got to start to remember scenes. And that the Pandora's box opens. Just as she mentions the Pandora's box opening, we start to hear a polyphony of voices speaking all at once, along with ambient sounds and a menacing, spatialized soundtrack. A long covered walkway opens before us. From then on, we are trapped in a forward tracking shot that leads us through the overgrown compound with all of its crumbling buildings. Another voice remarks, it was in open spaces, passageways like this one, that the girls were singled out for abuse. The only way of avoiding abuse was to keep one's head down and move forward. This downward forward gaze travels smoothly indoors and outdoors, passing through walls as well as floors, as if it, and we along with it, were a ghost. Clouds of pixels spread within ethereal strata, covering the outdoor structures and facades like a shroud, and layers of dots float towards us and then through us, blurring our field of vision. Following the frontward-facing movement, we are slowly made aware of the presence of the virtual environment closing in on us in the rear. To turn one's head or body to look behind is to verify that there's no getaway. The prison grounds expand on all sides. The combination of point cloud and automated tracking shots transforms the immersive exploration of the penitentiary environment into a form of haunting. Elements of the setting seemingly detach themselves from the background to drift through space as swarms of pixels, transversing the space where our body should be. And our body seems as if it had no consistency or solidity. But if we are indeed the ghost made to haunt this oppressive environment, we are still being dragged through it. Let me move to the next image here. The ghostly sensation of floating is further accentuated by the strange nocturnal feel of the scenes. Views of the buildings bear the shadows and contrasts born of sunlight. But because the sky has not been registered in the 3D photogrammetry imaging process, the imagery appears suspended in an expanse of a dark void. Some of the women talk about the impossibility to fathom what lies on the other side of the walls. And they reflect, even if you were to escape, would you know where to go? In a direct reference to Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, or Angelus Novus, the final shot does something different. While most of the film moves forward, this is a shot where we see ourselves being pushed backwards, facing this sort of island site. So we're pushed onwards and upwards to an elevated aerial view of the grounds. It is only as we hurtle forward into the future that we turn back to contemplate the ruins of the past. As the distance increases, the compound appears as an island surrounded by a progressively expanding sea of complete darkness. The spectral qualities of Parragirls' environment signals the impossibility to revive the past, let alone make good of what society owes these forgotten women, whom the powers that be once required to pay an imaginary debt to society by enduring hardship and abuse. Rather, it shows a willingness to retrieve the kind of stories and figures that have been erased from the public record. Yet all of its spectral dreamlike feel, there is an insistent presence at work in Parragirls that manifests itself through the voices of the 6 women who are narrators. With their diverse accents, rhythms, pitches, and tones, they describe the place while also reminiscing acknowledging that the antidotes and memories differ, qualifying their respective accounts as part of their experience of a much larger crowd of girls that passed through the prison's gates for more than a century before them. So let me move one forward here. The absenting of the viewer's body, however, has a radically different effect. Revisiting the place, guided by voices of the women, we are both transformed into spectral presences and pierced through by the multitude of ghostly gazes of a place once organized as a site of relentless surveillance. Diffuse like the clouds of dots, the palpable presence of an all-seeing authority remains. Okay, I'm going to move to the work of Gina Kim now. Similarly, each of Gina Kim's films is set on location, and each takes up a different issue concerning the establishment and continued existence of camp towns, the sexual exploitation of vulnerable women, and the purposely hidden connections between global capital, US military imperialism, and sex trafficking. The mapping of real-life physical spaces does not free us to explore these spaces as many interactive VR projects promise to do. And similarly to Hibberd's work, they do not allow us to become voyeurs who are offered a privileged, unbounded view of these locations. Aside from the typical side effects audiences experience from head-mounted VR displays, that is sort of a sense of disorientation or sometimes nausea, with Bloodless, Tearless, and Comfortless, we as participants are keenly aware that we are both embodied elsewhere and tethered to a single location within each filmic setting. Every location in which we are immersed, we are allowed to rotate 360 degrees, to scan the environment and to take in images that surround us. But we are fixed on a stationary axis. We cannot move within these spaces, nor can we set our own course of movement. Hence, tensions emerge between being able to spin around, but at the same time be fastened to a single spot, being continually moved from place to place without being clear what we are looking for until we are suddenly confronted with a vision of a specter. Okay, I'm going to play a clip that actually, I'm going to just sort of preface this. This is a clip that was compiled for me by Gina Kim. It is from Bloodless, and it's most of the images of the sort of ghostly figure that haunts the VR project or the VR film. Now, in this film, you might not actually see the ghost until the very end. Because you have to actually be looking in direction which the ghost moves. You can hear the footsteps of the ghost, and far more often than not, most of the participants will see the ghost passing by. But in any case, these are just simply images of the ghost moving through this space. So you get an idea of this sort of sense of haunting that these projects produce. I'm going to stop there. So in this scene where you're actually confronted with the ghost, it feels like you see the back of the ghost, but then it turns towards you. it almost as if it moves through you. So you have this very uncanny, visceral feeling like you've just been sort of, the ghost has just moved through your being. The ghostly address to the camera implicates us as participants, but it also forces us to acknowledge that places to which we have been immersed are haunted by numerous traumatic events. I'd like to turn to discuss what is so exceptional and strange about the locations chosen by Kim. So Bloodless was shot in Dongducheon, which is a camp town. Tearless was shot in the Monkey House, which was a state-sponsored makeshift medical facility where women were put in if they were suspected of having VD. And the last film, Comfortless, was shot in Americatown Corporation. All of these locations can be defined as traumascapes, spaces where VR participants are made to existentially experience the residual traces of suffering of former inhabitants. These are all spaces in which numerous women endured some form of violence or violation, both psychologically and physically. According to Donna Hughes, Catherine Chun, Derek Ellerman, from 1945 to 1999, U.S. servicemen have committed over 10,000 crimes in South Korea. And Choi Sang-hoon writes that between 1960 and 2004, 11 U.S. soldiers were found guilty of murdering sex workers in South Korea, while hundreds of women died in the Monkey House, either on account of penicillin shock or by suicide. But these sites do not attract, nor do they conform to how contemporary scholarship defines trauma landscapes or the dark tourism that often accompanies them, as, for example, places like Auschwitz, Sarajevo, or Ground Zero. Maria Tumarkin defines the traumascape as a distinct category of place, one that is transformed physically and psychically by the legacy of suffering. She writes, quote, "Traumascapes become much more than physical settings of tragedies. They emerge as spaces where events are experienced and re-experienced across time," end quote. For Tumarkin, the aftermath of a traumatic event is not just re-experienced by those survivors directly affected by it, they are dispersed and belong to a range of individuals and collectives, like the family of survivors, eyewitnesses, visitors, people who live near the location, artists or writers who address the subject. She thus implies that landscapes have the ability to transmit post-traumatic affect to those unassociated with the violence committed on those sites, not unlike those advocates that see VR as an empathy machine. Thus, the nature of trauma as conscious and therefore necessarily secondhand experiences varies wildly on account of such a diverse range of people who may be affected. But even so, this definition of the traumascape seems oddly reminiscent of a memory site, a memorial that commemorates a war, the long history of colonialism, a natural disaster, or even a terrorist attack. It is as if in order to be a traumascape, there must be some public acknowledgement of a tragic event occurring on location, and it is this clearly marked memory that inhabits the present. What Kim's work suggests is that traumascapes are exceptional places made to trap individuals, but more importantly, to ensure that future inhabitants will be both traumatized and effaced even before they arrive on location, as well as long after they leave. Thus, Kim's traumascapes are neither marked by specific events, nor do they signify one particular time. They are instead indefinite and untimely, repetitive, reoccurring, and uncanny. As Marie Lowe points out, except for sex workers, Korean nationals are legally barred from entering Camptown clubs and bars, catering to U.S. soldiers, since sex work is illegal and prohibited in South Korea. Yet sex work was and still is publicly acknowledged as taking place on these sites. During the 1960s, South Korean newspapers referred to sex workers as, quote, an illegal cancer-like but necessary evil, end quote. Because, as one article put it, these comfort women are also frontline warriors in winning dollars. Hence, camp towns remain legal exceptions, not only condoned by South Korean government, but high-ranking officials even invested in their development. Kim's site-specific work draws attention to the trauma that individual women might have experienced, but it reveals more about how camp towns were organized so as to ensure control over comfort women who lived within them. Kim treats the monkey house and the camp town less as a backdrop for all kinds of suffering than as a machinery of power. Both Bloodless and Comfortless are filmed on location in camp towns built for American soldiers to encounter special comfort women units near American military bases. But because these camp towns, like the numerous military bases, are placed on foreign soil, they are also, as Jody Kim explains, juridically ambiguous spaces upon which the operative logics of U.S. aspirations to seize metapolitical authority prevail. She defines these places as laboratories, quote, where we see the convergence of hyper-militarization, legal liminality, and the negotiation of metapolitical authority between geopolitical powers and global capital interests, end quote. In Bloodless, we find actual U.S. soldiers casually walking into and out of bars and sex clubs with M4 machine guns strapped to their backs. While the dynamic of power is evident, the camp town is a non-sovereign space. In other words, while these spaces clearly exhibit definitive geopolitical or metapolitical, sexual, and economic hierarchies, they make it difficult to hold any one individual or organization liable for anything that might happen within them, since there is no one particular state or legal system tasked with administrating or overseeing what goes on in these locations. The irony of metapolitical authority is that it wields almost absolute power. It is accountable to no person, state, or organization. As a result, such non-sovereign spaces enable, if not invite, violent events to unfold. The women who continue to work in these areas, however, remain literally extrajuridical. They are not part of Korean society. They have been and are treated as social pariahs. This leaves them in a state of precarity, treated as disposable, as non-persons. Unlike the missing person or the absentee, these women have not physically vanished, but they are deterritorialized, exiting from South Korean jurisdiction and society only to be reterritorialized, not by a state, but by an economic system of perpetual debt. Okay, I'm going to move to an image of the monkey house here. Sites like the monkey house, which is this makeshift alleged medical building, that are almost extraterrestrial. They are literally extricated from any official narrative and any form of public acknowledgement. In her attempt to gain permission to shoot the monkey house, Kim was baffled as to why the current owners of the land on which the building was situated refused to acknowledge that the building ever existed. In fact, as Kim points out, the land was owned by a family that later became a foundation, but the building was never owned by anyone. Not only have the current proprietors attempted to make the monkey house disappear from plain sight, so has the Korean state, and even the building's neighbors. When Kim visited the site asking the people who worked or lived in the adjacent buildings if they knew what went on in the building, while literally pointing to the building, the existing edifice, The neighbors responded by saying that they did not see any building, refusing to acknowledge what was in fact right before their eyes, thus giving the site a different kind of spectral quality. The monkey house is both materially there, even though it's falling to ruin, and conceptually, or more precisely, politically absent from public discourse. Similarly, Comfortless provides a detailed digital mapping of a Camptown city under erasure, one that is in the process of being demolished and redeveloped. Tearless and Comfortless therefore provide inconvenient forensic traces that mark the complex relationship between place, trauma, oppression, neocolonialism, and global capital. Any affective experience we may have from being immersed in these places cannot amount to the identification with all of those who suffered there. Trauma creates a cognitive impasse. For Ulrich Beyer, it is outside of the grasp of our cognition and therefore can bypass experience and yet register with great force on an individual's mind and body. However, the act of registering should not be mistaken for knowing, experiencing, or even becoming consciously aware of one's feelings. VR films like Bloodless, Tearless, and Comfortless make us aware of the aporia between embodied feeling and knowing that results in a sense of groundlessness. Though Kim's projects provide us with minimal amounts of contextual information, mostly through their title cards. Here, I'll just give you an example that we read at the beginning and the end of each film. No VR project can restore what Walter Benjamin calls the lost context of experience, but they all have the capacity to embed the participant within a particular location. This tethering of participants to a single location in some parallel present or uncertain past affords them a sense of being there that is both embodied, tethered, and disembodied, literally without a body. As an example of such an uncanny experience occurs at the very end of Bloodless, when the viewer is made to enter a small room in which a mysterious woman entertains soldiers who pay her for sex. Kim locates the camera just over the makeshift bed. It is a sense of confinement coupled with a sense of hovering that gives us a radical feeling of disquiet. As Kim explains, many participants recounted the sense of floating in the room, experiencing a sense of groundlessness, even if they were still tethered to a single location. This otherworldly sensation is only further compounded when we, as ghostly participants, look in the mirror, only to find the image of the woman, the ghost that we've been tracing through the VR film, lying dead on the floor, profusely bleeding. But if we spin around the room, we see no evidence of the body, nor any traces of blood. It is only through the mirror, through the looking glass, that we can witness the past. The mirror may reflect a moment in the past, but we cannot inhabit or participate in that moment. Whereas contextualist approaches remain fundamentally flawed by their own structural absence, VR offers its own kind of immemorial experience, one that could put us as participants at the scene of the crime, even though we are not made to witness a crime as it unfolds. Most participants admit to experiencing a deep sense of horror when immersed in these spaces. How exactly can we describe this virtual but intense experience? Rather than argue that we can somehow bear witness to past experiences, I would like to suggest that the way we as participants experience empathy is outside of any existing memory. It is immemorial. But this immemorial empathetic experience allows us to be immersed in these exceptional spaces in a manner that conveys a sense of powerlessness. And I'd like to conclude by examining how this emplacement offers us a sense of being present, at the same time being completely disoriented and disembodied. This uncanny feeling of being besides ourselves effectively questions all of those subject positions commonly associated with the linguistic and the literary, a subjectivity present in all narrative forms of representation, as well as a sense of perspective or a subjective point of view, as we often find in cinema. That is, language, literature, and narrative cinema establishes a subject position, both as the position of address to the viewer or the reader, and the position of expression of the creator, thus creating a relation of the creator to her audience. This is often done through a complex set of devices, like characters who readers or viewers are invited to identify with, language that has a logical sequencing and narrative meaning, or the place of the camera that establishes a point of view, a perspective that anchors the viewer. This subject position is what Jane Gaines calls a placeholder. Albeit generic, the placeholder indicates a subject position classified by personal pronouns like I, he, she, and individuals who possess their own agency. It is this kind of subject position, bloodless, tearless, and comfortless, question. The ghostly figures of comfort women seem to be non-sovereign or extrajuridical subjects, more specifically, non-persons, denied both rights and even a name. For example, in Comfortless, as one American soldier asked the ghostly woman appearing in the mirror of a diner, "Hey, you got a name?" But another responds, "She's Hot Mama, that's her name." Like the other ghosts of the trilogy, she never speaks at all. All we ever hear are the voices of American soldiers, or at least until the end when she confronts us as spectators, voyeurs who are hiding behind the clean laundry hanging out to dry to ask us who we are. Indeed, just who we are as participants becomes both an existential question and one that challenges the role of the space holder, since we shift roles from participant to spectator, voyeur, intruder, detective trying to piece together the clues to some old crime case, empathizing with the victims of the space unfolding before us, but identified with the institutions that confine them. In this case, the placeholder seems to index the placelessness of the non-sovereign subjects, non-subjects that are emplaced but have no sense of belonging. If, as literary and apparatus theories of all sorts tell us, that the subject is made by various narrative and cinematic mechanisms, then Kim's VR films show us how easy it is to efface or unmake such subjects. Yet, that is not all that is going on here. Even if the ghosts, particularly in Bloodless and Tearless, are denied some form of narrative or semantic subjectivity, they are still present, and it is their presence that we as participants experience, along with presumably our own precarious subjectivity. VR does not need to rely on such narrative devices to make the participant feel present or immersed within the mise en scène. But Kim's and Hibberd's VR films do ask us to think about our relation to the environments in which we are immersed. What stares back at us from such ruined landscapes is seemingly present, but effectively absent. It can only be defined as uncanny. Hence, there is something both radically intimate that can touch viewers personally and something dangerously speculative in this virtual imagery that cannot be contained or controlled by either the cinematographer or creator, nor the subject represented in the images. Feeling the presence of some ghostly otherness, however, does not necessarily entail any actual relation to the dead, nor does it necessarily involve any understanding of the unique historical circumstances of the trauma or suffering people endured in these spaces. In fact, these visceral connections of the dead with the living are often decontextualized, distorted, and detached, leading us to challenge the assumption that art somehow possesses a redemptive or reparative power. Leo Bersani calls this tendency to salvage some damaged experience the, quote, explicit dogma of modern high culture that enables morality of a humanistic criticism, end quote. While there can be no re-inhabiting of some traumatic experience, except inauthentically in the form of representation and identification, Kim's trilogy and Hibbert's film puts participants in what Bersani describes as an impossible standpoint, immersed both in the past and the present, immersed in and removed from the scope of existence altogether. That is, as a participant, we become ghost-like, haunting both the past and the present, immersed in these audiovisual spaces, but knowingly absent, estranged from them. We are offered traces of the past that we experience bodily, and at the same time, we are asked to reflect on that past. This reflection ultimately involves an ethical form of thinking, feeling, a critical, thoughtful ethics, as opposed to a mode of empathy designed to make us identify with others, different ideologies, or social practices. It also offers us an ethical form of questioning of our own engagement in the world. Unlike narrative-based modes of representation that identify subjects and subject-object relations of all sorts, whether they be scholarly histories, documentary films, or even digital forensic architecture simulations, VR films like Parragirls, Bloodless, Tearless, and Comfortless afford the participant the uncanny experience of being put in a place without being able to claim or identify with any perceivable subject. This active emplacement also questions our role or function within these uncomfortable spaces. Are we participants, viewers, users, witnesses, non-persons, detectives, or just placeholders? Thus, Hibberd and Kim's films create environments that offer us this radical sense of groundlessness. All right, I am done. Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Okay.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.